I was 62, and my official title on the manifest was Menagerie and Morale Officer, a polite way of saying I fed the animals and nobody bothered me about it. 12 nations put people on the Kestrel Compact. Nobody thought hard about who'd tend the 3 creatures riding along as goodwill mascots and emergency scouts. That fell to me, because I was too old for the geology teams and too calm for the bridge. Bruin was the biggest, a squat armored quadruped bred off some frontier world for hauling ice cores, all muscle and plated hide, gentle until he wasn't. Tilathre was smaller, chitinous, fast, built for squeezing into crevasses no human or Bruin could follow. And then there was Soul, still mostly puppy, a lean wolf-shaped thing with 2 big paws and amber eyes, who slept against my collarbone every night, whether I invited him or not. They weren't supposed to bond to one man. The program wanted them adaptable, loyal to the mission, easy to hand off to whoever needed a scout that day. Somewhere around the 2nd month out, all 3 of them decided the mission was me, and no amount of retraining schedule changed that. I never fought it. A man my age doesn't get offered family twice. Mornings on the compact, before the science teams were up, I'd walk the 3 of them down the cargo ring for exercise, and it became something the crew looked forward to without admitting it. Bruin would flatten himself against the deck plating so junior techs could scratch behind the armored ridge over his shoulders, letting out a low grinding sound that took me a month to recognize as contentment. Teethray kept to the shadows along the bulkheads, watching everyone, cataloging them the way I later understood the moon itself had been cataloging us. And Soul chased his own reflection across the floor plates until he ran headlong into a supply crate, every single time, and acted personally betrayed by its existence. I'd raised working animals my whole career, on 3 different worlds, and never had one choose me back the way these 3 did. They didn't obey. Obedience is what you train into an animal that doesn't care about you. What Bruin and Teethray and Soul gave me was closer to a verdict they'd reached on their own, renewed every morning. This is our person, and everyone else on this ship is merely tolerated. We put down on Varn 11 days before the incident. It's a moon, ice over rock, cold enough to kill you in 90 seconds bare-skinned, and it had been broadcasting something for years before we got close. A slow pulse. Not language exactly, more like a held breath. The scientists called it the ledger. Whatever was under that ice had been counting something about us long before we arrived, and what it was counting, we found out, was a debt. 30 years back, before I was in this line of work, Earth ran a weapons test in high orbit that scarred a chunk of near space nobody thought anyone was watching. Varn had been watching. The voice that finally spoke through the ledger called itself the Cold Assessors, and it did not ask us for anything. It informed us. Humanity had been weighed, recklessness carried a cost, and the cost would be collected. A slow freeze pulled down through Earth's upper atmosphere, patient and total. A verdict that doesn't care whether you meant harm or just weren't paying attention. Nobody on that crew was built to argue cosmology with an ice moon. We kept working. The day it happened, Dr. Renata Cole was out on the frost flats running core samples with 2 techs, and I was 300 meters back with the pack, because Soul had gotten it into his head that every survey trip was also a hunting trip, and somebody had to keep him from chasing the wind. I heard the crack before I understood what it was. Not ice breaking, ice sinking, a whole plate of what looked like solid frost turning, in half a second, into something closer to wet ash. Renata went down to her chest in it, then her shoulders, the frost marrow swallowing her the way quicksand swallows a boot, except this quicksand was 40 below and airless 6 inches past the surface. Her techs threw themselves flat and got a line to her, but the marrow doesn't let go for a couple of humans and a rope. It let go, eventually for Bruin, whose plated weight let him crawl belly down across the crust without breaking it further, and for Teethray, who vanished under the crust into the dark pockets beneath and came back with purchase on rock we couldn't see. I was screaming into my comm for a winch team the whole time, but by the time anyone else arrived, my pack had already pulled her most of the way out. Bruin's foreclaws hooked into her rescue loop, Teethray bracing beneath her boots like a ledge that had grown legs. I got there at a dead run, closer to a controlled fall at my age on that terrain, and for one clean second I believed we'd done it. Renata was up on solid crust, coughing, alive, both techs hauling her back from the edge. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Sol's rebreather cracked somewhere in the scramble. A stone, a shard of ice, I never found out which, and a wolf-pup built for a temperate world doesn't survive Varn's air for more than a few minutes once the seal goes. He didn't whimper. That's the part I keep coming back to. He just went still against the ice, breathing too fast and too shallow, looking up at me the exact way he did every night before curling against my collarbone, like the rest of it was somebody else's problem as long as I was standing there. I did the only math that mattered to me. I stripped my own reserve cell, cracked his housing open with hands already going numb, and fed him what I had. Then I lay down over him in the snow, because a body, even an old one, holds heat a little while, and I didn't have anything else left to give. I remember the cold getting simple. Not painful anymore, just quiet, like the moon had stopped asking questions of me. I remember Brune's weight coming down on my other side, Treefray, folding in close enough I could feel it breathing, and I remember, faintly, snarling, not at me, at the rescue team trying to reach us. My pack had decided that anyone approaching fast in that moment was a threat, and for a handful of seconds, 3 creatures capable of tearing a grown man apart formed a wall around one dying old handler and a suffocating pup, teeth bared at their own rescuers, and would not be moved. I woke up on the Kestrel Compact's medical deck 2 days later, with Sol's rebreather scarred snout pressed under my jaw, and a voice coming through every speaker on the ship that wasn't mine, wasn't human, and wasn't cold anymore. The cold assessors had been watching the whole thing, not just the rescue. They'd been watching 30 years, cataloging every reckless thing we'd done, building their case. What they said, once they spoke again, was that they had misjudged the shape of the debt. They had assumed a species that built weapons in orbit would spend its strength only on itself. They had not accounted for a man giving away his last hour of air to a creature with no strategic value, or for 3 animals choosing to snarl at their own crew rather than let their handler die alone. Their exact words, translated flat and formal through the ship's system, were that the debt was rendered and the kinship witnessed. That became the phrase the whole crew used afterward, half joke, half reverence, whenever someone did something small and stubbornly kind, rendered and witnessed, like it was a stamp on a form. The freeze order was withdrawn. Earth never even knew how close it had come. Renata came to see me on the medical deck before I was steady enough to sit up on my own, still favoring the shoulder the marrow had wrenched. She sat on the edge of the cot, looked at Sol, and said she'd spent 11 years training for exactly the crisis that had almost killed her, and none of that training was what pulled her out of the ice. What pulled her out was a creature that had never met her before that morning, deciding, on no evidence at all, that she was worth the risk. She said it like it bothered her, the way a scientist is bothered by something true that doesn't fit the model. I told her I'd stopped trying to model it years ago. Some things you just feed and shelter and let sleep against your collarbone, and eventually they decide for themselves what you're worth. You don't get to argue with the verdict. You just try to be worth it. I still don't fully understand what changed the assessors' minds, not in any way I could explain to a committee. I know what I saw when I could open my eyes again. Sol curled into the hollow of my ribs like he'd never left, Brune's head resting heavy across both our legs, Toothray perched on the rail above us, watching the door like the argument wasn't over yet. Maybe that was the point the ice had missed for 30 years. You can measure a species by what it builds to survive. You learn something different measuring what it's willing to die keeping warm. I'm 62, and I run a menagerie on a ship most of the crew still can't pronounce the name of, and I have 3 creatures who decided, against every training schedule ever written, that I was theirs to guard. Varn's ice never froze anything of ours in the end. It just finally understood what it was looking at.